Up next is Dana Chisnell, and here we go.
Thank you, Brian. Am I audible? Yes. Let us do this really fancy switching thing. I want to give you time. Hi, everybody. Hello. Hi. Thanks for coming today. I'd like to start with a story. This is a story about one voter out of the more than 1,000 that my team and I have talked with, learned from, listened to over the last 5 or 6 years. My team is at the Center for Civic Design. Bill struck me as someone who had been through a lot. It was impossible to tell at first glance just how old he was, but when he came into the room where we were going to be working together, well, I saw that his left arm swung a little bit differently from his right, and he walked with a limp, but he had a big, toothy grin, and he was really friendly. He was also really flirty. This was in the fall of 2013, and we were in a library in Berkeley, California, where my team and I, along with the League of Women Voters, was working on a study we were doing about information about voting and elections. In California, every county is required to send out a voter guide to every registered voter ahead of every election. They do this because they have to. They don't have people to write their content. And they do a reasonably good job. We were working on a new template and a new information architecture for that voter guide. And Bill was going to be one of the participants in our study. I asked Bill what questions he had about the upcoming election. He said he didn't know where to even start. He'd never voted before. I said, well, that's fine. You know there's an election coming up, right? He says, yes, ma'am. It's pretty hard to avoid that. This was a couple of weeks before a statewide primary in June that year. So I gave him this little booklet that we'd written up. It's a little prototype. And I gave him instructions for how to mark it up so we could see what was working and what wasn't for him. And I said, do you have any questions? Are you ready to start? And Bill said, yes, ma'am. It's going to take me a while, though. I'm only just now learning to read. We were working with Bill and a bunch of other people at the library because they were all in an adult reading program. And so I said, that's fine. We've got plenty of time. We can work through it together if you want to. Or we could just talk. He's like, no problem. I'm going to give it a go. So he started. And one of the first things he encountered was the Voter Bill of Rights. This was a revelation to him, especially the part that said that he could vote. He says, ma'am, is this document real? Did you just make this for the purposes of this study that you're doing? And I said, no, this is real, Bill. This is a real thing. He's like, this says that I can vote. He told me that he had been incarcerated, and one of the reasons that he hadn't learned to read was that he hadn't learned to read yet when he went to prison. So I said, yes, you can register to vote. He says, how do I get to do that? I said, as soon as we're done with the session, we could do it online if you want to. He says, that's amazing. He was totally fired up, really super energized. So he went through the 24-page booklet. He gave us incredibly valuable feedback. And my clicker is stuck. And it did take a long time. When he'd finished and I'd got all my questions answered, he wanted to know how to register to vote. And so my partner from the League of Women Voters, who had been there working with me on this study, said, come on over here. She already had pulled up the Secretary of State's online voter registration website, because free Wi-Fi in libraries, how awesome is that? And in 2 minutes, Bill was registered to vote for the first time in his life. He practically floated out of the room. He shook hands with everybody on his way out. Our practice is to have people fill out the demographic forms at the end of the session. And later I learned that Bill was 56 years old and he'd been in prison for 40 years. But now he could vote. So we got him registered to vote. What happens after that? What's his experience going to be like getting to a place where he can exercise his franchise? So to understand the experience that Bill might have, my team had to start with a question. Our first big questions helped us find the beginning of the journey of American voters. How do they think? What questions do they actually have about elections? It is not what you see on the news. But we also wanted to look at how election administrators, so people who put on elections, who are not the campaigns, they're government people, how election administrators think about elections themselves. So we actually took a look at this second question first. And to do that, we went out and we looked at 145 county election websites. This is not the most sexy work you're ever going to do, but it was really interesting. What we did was we cataloged in spreadsheets the words that were used in headings, links, and graphics by where they are on the page, basic mapping. And when we looked across these 145 websites, and by the way, there were about 5,000 of them, we narrowed it down to this sample. When you start looking at where things land on a page, you start to see patterns. And from that, we drew some conclusions about how election officials think about elections, what they think is important, and what they think voters should know. And then we did some usability tests. We asked people across the country. This is also, by the way, leading up to the election in the presidential election in 2012. So this started in September and ended a little bit after Election Day. And we had volunteers all over the place helping us do this. These were remote, moderated usability tests that we had scripted. So we asked people first, what's your big question about the upcoming election? And then, what other questions do you have? So we cataloged all that. Then we asked people to go to their local website to try to find the answers. You can imagine what happened. But this gave us an amazing view into the mental models of people inside government and voters outside government. And here's what we learned. This is how election officials think about the process of voting. It's basically chronological, and it starts with a thing that they have to do, which is basically announcing that there's an election and what day it is. But they think it starts with you registering to vote or checking your voter registration or updating your voter registration. And it ends with checking the results of the election. This may look like a familiar process to you. But when we talk to voters, when we ask them what questions they had about elections, this is what we heard. This was the number one question. What is on the ballot. All of the decisions flow from that. Now, we've heard this repeatedly, not just about websites, but about all kinds of voter ed and voter information. What's on the ballot is the number one question. It's the driver. And if you look at where it lands in the process, in the sort of received process, the institutional process, it's pretty far in. So this finding was a really big deal. It rocked the world of election administration. When we went out talking about the questions that voters have and how they think about this stuff, and how the questions are being answered or not being answered, a lot of them go unanswered. Election administrators around the country were shocked. They had never thought of asking this question before. But now they knew why they were experiencing some of the pain that they were feeling in trying to put on any given election and making sure that people knew what they were doing. So as I said, this is not exclusive to websites. As we've tested information and education in lots of channels, we've heard the same thing. And what this really means, we think, is people are asking, what's important enough to invest in this process? Why should I be part of this activity? This is a big deal because we make voting in America really challenging on lots of different levels. It's really different from other places in the world. So, for example, this is a ballot from the Scottish referendum in 2014. It's a really simple question. Yes or no, should we stay in the UK or should we not? This is from the Catalan referendum about a year ago. One question. This is a ballot from the UK election in June 2017. This is all there is on this ballot, a list of parties, and you rank them. Pretty simple and straightforward. But if we have a look at American ballots, it tells a different story. So in 2016, everybody in the world knew that there was an election for president in the US. That's not a big deal. But in San Francisco, California, where this is from, there were also elections for US senator, for congressperson, for state senator, for state assembly person, a judge, Board of Education, College Board, Director of the Bay Area Rapid Transit, and positions on the Board of Supervisors. But that's not all. There were also more than 40 questions on that ballot at the city, county, and state level. And this is just a checklist. This isn't the actual ballot. This is what ballots actually look like. This is a typical ballot designed for a system where you fill in a bubble and then push a paper through a scanner. The scanner tallies the votes. This one from San Luis Obispo is fairly short, but each paper can be pretty long, like up to 19 inches long. So imagine that printed on one side, all the things you need to pay attention to, and another side. They're all printed double-sided. And you might have multiple ballot cards, okay? So there are a lot of elements here, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of constraints. But this is the beautiful, wicked problem that my team has taken on and that we've been working with election officials on for quite a long time now. So when you take all that together, voters' needs and their context and what their questions are and how they try to answer those questions, what their challenges are, what they're willing to invest in their own time and energy, well, seems like an easy fix, right? Or maybe it is like government generally. Hey, so what if we ran it like a business? How would that work out? So, learning that voters are ballot-centric and that for most people, their decisions about whether and how to participate derived from that was a really, really big deal. So I want to actually show you how we mapped this out. This is the epic journey. So across the top of the map, this is the receive process. This is the one that we all think we go through and that election officials see as the process. Below that is the voter's path. This one is the privileged path. You can tell that because it's green. So across all of our research, as I said, first big question, what's on the ballot? Great. There is a thing that I care enough about that I want to be in this process. Then, next is, how do I get to take part? What are my options? Do I have to vote at the polling place on election day? Or is there early voting? Or can I vote by mail? Or can I vote on my phone? Like, what are the ways I can get access? Our guy, our privileged guy, has no problem with this because he loves the civic process. He knows exactly where his polling place is. He's been voting in the same place for 15 years. His polling place hasn't changed. So his plan is he's going to vote at the polling place. Next, because he doesn't need to know where his polling place is, there's no homework for him there, is a typical step around learning to mark the ballot, because these things do change from major election to major election. But again, his county or his town bought their voting system in 2004 when the Congress set aside money for them to do that, and they've been using the same voting system since then. That's a different conversation. So he's confident he knows how to mark the ballot. Plus, he got a vote-by-mail ballot and a sample ballot with a voter guide in the mail. So he's super well prepared. When we get to his step 5, he's in the polling place, he's marking the ballot, everything is good, no big deal. He even gets to skip a couple of steps because he doesn't need voter ID where he is. Boom, done. He goes online to the county election website to check the results. This is rare, by the way. And that they get updated automatically as they come in. This is about as frictionless as it gets, but you can see through this kind of winding path that it is not how government sees it. Now, this is not the experience that most American voters actually have. Most voters in the US experience voting as a test, both in terms of what they have to know about what the issues are and who's running, and to get through the gauntlet of actually getting a ballot in their hands. Some of the steps are very well intentioned, right? I mean, you want to make sure that only people who are actually eligible get to vote. And you want to give as many options as possible for people to take part. And how hard could marking a ballot actually be? But what I'm about to show you is much closer to the experience that most people who are voting in the United States actually have. If you're a designer in a large organization, you might recognize bits of this too. You are maybe unintentionally throwing up some of these kinds of issues as well. So again, the government path, and here's the burdened voter. Again, we start in the same place. What's on the ballot? Is there something that's so important to me and my family that is going to change how our lives go as a result of this election that I need to take part? But our burdened voter, it doesn't get a voter guide, and the voter guide would have definitely helped because it would be in plain language, and it would have candidate statements, and it would have questions, and it would explain the questions and the measures. That would actually be helpful. But only about 9% of 5,000 jurisdictions actually send these things out. trustworthy information is very hard to find online. See Margot's talk. And deciding how to take part is tough because there isn't any good information coming to our burdened voter about what the options are. Is there early voting? What are the hours and days? What are the locations? Because it's not where the polling places are. And now he's found out that he's missed the window for doing that. Our guy just moved to the town where he lives now, and he's never voted at his polling place before. It's way far away from work. This is not unusual. But he thinks he knows where it is, and he manages to find it on a map at least. Where he lives, he needs voter ID, which he has. So that's a victory. But to get this ID was not free. In Texas, on average, the closest DMV is 25 miles away. We're lucky in Massachusetts that the RMV has branches all over the place. And so far, nobody's talking about closing most of them. But there's the time involved in getting there and being there and waiting and filling out the forms and paying the fee. So even if the plastic card is free, the cost of getting it mean it's not. So now we're at step 5, way over there on the left, and he's just now thinking about registration. Am I registered to vote? What's my registration status? We're pretty far down the road here. He had registered to vote, but since he moved, when he moved house, he moved to a new county, so he has to update his voter registration. He does not have Bill's online voter registration. He has to download a PDF, print it out, fill it out, sign it in ink, find an envelope, find a stamp, send it in. He finally gets to the polling place on election day, and he is just gobsmacked by there being things on the ballot that he didn't know anything about before he showed up. There are contests and candidates that he knew nothing about until this moment, and he's super confused about how to mark this ballot because he's never seen a thing like this before. So what we're seeing here, to compare the two, is behavioral economics playing out at every single steps. This is, by the way, what's happening in practically everything that we design. The question is, do I stay in this process or do I leave this process? Is there value for me staying in this process? Am I getting what I need out of it, or are the obstacles too high? Is the cost too great? Because the obstacles, the cost of the obstacles is cumulative. The burden does grow with every step. It's not removed when you get over one. It's more for the next one. So when you add to this the buzz of the information ecosystem that we saw leading up to the 2016 election, in an electoral system where people are exhausted by the time the election actually happens, well, the whole thing can feel pretty overwhelming. And so I give you all this as context. There's this notion that people who don't vote don't care, that they're apathetic. But a thing that we have come to realize is that's probably not the case. We actually don't think that there's any such thing as voter apathy. We believe that Americans really do care about voting, almost all of them, to the extent that when they are surveyed, they lie about having voted. There's a lot of social pressure to vote. But for some, it's really hard. For some, the trade-offs at every step mean dealing with the problems of the now. I got to pick up my kid at daycare, or I can't afford to take off work, at the expense of weighing in about the future that can't be really known. Again, We never asked this question, are there people who don't care about voting? What we asked was, what obstacles do people face when they're casting a vote? How do they get to the point where they can vote the way they intend? And what we learned, excuse me, is that people really try very, very hard to get a ballot in their hands and to cast it. Now, this kind of stuff is true across government in my experience. Whether you're trying to vote or applying for food assistance or buying health insurance or paying your taxes, you're all going to pay your taxes, right? Or just trying to get a business license. There are many more steps than you think. And there are many more steps than most of us pay attention to when we're mapping out processes and journeys. How the organization thinks of the process and the activities is really different from how people actually go through it. Users do make rational trade-offs at every step. Now, we probably could not have laid out a research plan ahead of time that would lead us to this point. And I want to make this clear. The map is just an artifact. It's not the product. We didn't do this research to make that diagram. We did the research to begin to understand the problem. So this is what our main research agenda looked like. Not only did we hear 500 stories leading up to the point where we first mapped the thing out, we have more staff now, so we could increase our volume pretty fast. It took a lot of people, though, to get to those stories. After all, design's a team sport. The first one needed about 30 researchers and 40 participants. The next one took 100 interviews by my co-researcher and me on the street. And we did usability tests there, too. The next one gave us more than 35 voters with low literacy. Changed my life. Then we worked with hundreds of poll workers and their bosses across the country. Next, this happened last year, my team tested messaging with about 40 participants and did a diary study with 50 more participants. And then we worked with a couple of dozen county election officials to implement some of the things that we had learned. So we didn't do this alone. We couldn't possibly do this alone. We had a lot of partners, volunteers, grad students, basically a lot of help and a lot of varied methods. Because it turns out that hard problems are just hard, and this is why I love working in this space. There's plenty of work to do. I sort of expect to be doing this until I die. I hope it's a long time. So we had this first question. What questions do voters actually have about elections? And if you know you've done research, right? Every question you ask leads to another question. So this was a series of adjacent possibles. You start to peel away the relatively easy problems, and you get to the harder things, the subtler things, the more nuanced things. And I think, by the way, that this is a space that we're all in now. We've solved the easy problems in design. And your jobs are about to get a hell of a lot harder. We did come away with some pretty major insights along the way. And I think most of these are generalizable. People want to know what's actually happening in an election and how it will affect their lives. They want to know whether it's this particular activity is worth investing in, what will be different because they took part, because these people were elected or this measure passed or didn't pass. People want to vote, but if they can't relate to what the outcomes are in their daily lives and the people who they're close to, they won't vote. If they don't know what to do, they won't show up. People who are new to this process don't even know where to start asking questions. It feels like an exclusive club that they are not part of. and that they'll have to take a test to get in. We've heard so many people say, okay, great, I see on the news, or I hear on the news, or I see on social media that there's a long wait time to get into the polling place. But what happens after I get there? Will people be nice to me? Will there be a test? Do I have to sign a contract? Like, people don't know. And we've kept this mysterious, assuming that everybody knows how voting actually works. Think about this in terms of somebody learning about investing for the first time, or somebody who's been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Like, you're basically throwing people into a similar situation. They have to become experts instantly to make decisions. People drop out because every obstacle is cumulative. It diminishes the investment that they're willing to make. It's exhausting, and the burden is great. In the US, another burden is that nearly half of American adults read at or below the 6th grade level. Pair that with possible low digital literacy. So we have learned that always including people who have low literacy or low English proficiency in our studies makes all the difference in delivering a great experience for everyone. This was a monster revelation for me personally. I've been working in plain language for decades before we started specifically including people with low literacy, and I thought I had that licked, right? I thought I was good at plain language. And when we brought in the first 5 participants, they kicked our asses. And it was great. Voters are frustrated in their attempts to separate signal from noise. And in 2016, this was worse than ever, and it's only going to get harder. If users can't tell what's important, if voters can't tell what's important, and understand the messages they're getting and distinguish between what's real and what's not, what's trustworthy and what's not, they will just stop trusting the entire system. They'll exhaust their willingness to invest in the greater good, or even their own personal good. So all the information, all of it, has to be useful and usable and accessible and clear and plain and accessible. So taken together, all these highlights tell quite the story. And along the way, through all of the stories from voters, we heard just how hard it is for people to vote. There are dozens of hurdles, and one of the things that we've learned is that there's still a lot that we don't know. These are just the ones that we know about. There are way more for others, for people who are, let's say, in the military or living overseas. There are more obstacles for people who live in underserved districts that we haven't visited yet. There are even more for people who have limited English proficiency. We don't do a good job of delivering content in language. So now we have a research agenda for the next 10 years. So let me tie this up. In case you haven't heard me loud and clear, what people care about is what's happening in this election? What are my decisions? What will be different? What's on the ballot that I have to make decisions about? We make getting to that point where people can make decisions really hard, and we make interacting with those decisions very challenging. It gets harder as it goes. It doesn't get easier. And when people can't relate what's happening in policy and political life to their own lives, they opt out. Now, there are a bunch of ways you can help, because I know you want to. If you want to change how this works for people, I have some ideas for you. First, register to vote and update your voter registration. Do it right now. No, just kidding. do it soon because there are local elections and there's a statewide primary coming up. So pay attention and get that fixed. Next, sign up to be a poll worker. The average age of poll workers in the United States is somewhere between 69 and 72. You all would bring down that average quite a bit. And there's more and more technology in the polling place every election. Electronic poll books, electronic voting systems that actually you use to mark the ballot and then cast. But also, I'm kind of happy to hear this actually, more technology for the people who are actually working the election, for poll workers. So instead of paper tallies, you'll start to see apps emerging. And being involved with that and informing that would be awesome. Next, if you can't invest in being a poll worker, which, by the way, takes some training. You have to go to training, and it's a long day and doesn't pay very much money, but wait, that's probably exactly like your day job. Sign up to go observe an election. You can do this. You don't have to be associated with a party, although your town clerk may kind of freak out at first. Just say, check the bylaws, is fine. Sign up to be an observer. Go for a couple of hours because this is fascinating field research about what people bring and how they think and what happens. If you are super active, you might think about holding neighborhood meetups where you work with your neighbors to talk about who the candidates are and what the issues are. A cool thing for that ballot that we saw from San Francisco with those 40 questions, we heard stories of people organizing their neighbors, people in their apartment buildings and things like that, to hold dinner parties where they assigned each other measures to investigate, and then they held a dinner party the next week where people did readouts, basically, of what they had learned. Nonpartisan, that was one of the rules, right? But just what you had learned and what the implications of these things passing was. So that's pretty cool. I love that idea. One thing we know works really great for people is if you have a plan for voting, we actually publish a checklist. If you have a plan, you are more likely to vote. So make a plan for yourself and make a plan with someone else to take with you. Oh, and by the way, if you would like to influence the next generation, one of the things we've heard over and over and over again for the last 15 years is people who are deeply civically engaged tell a seminal story about being taken to the polling place as a child by an adult. Find a kid. Pick them up on the street. Take them to the polling place with you. Rent one if you don't have one of your own. So that's what I've got for you. But there's one more thing. I'll leave you with this. Find the truth. Tell the truth. Thank you. You bet. Do we have time for questions?
If you want. Time for questions. If you want.
If people have questions.
Please, by all means. Absolutely.
Dana, thank you.
Is this on?
I'll speak up. Okay.
No, really.
Okay.
It's very hard.
Dana, thank you.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you.
The Center for Civic Design, is it nonpartisan?
Yeah, the Center for Civic Design is a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3. We do applied design research to make tools and templates for election officials.
Okay. So I think we can't help but look at this important work with the political overlay. And my question is, for people who don't think this is important because they think that they look at all of those obstacles and they're saying, all right, well, are they likely to vote one way or another? Or they think states' rights matter, county rights matter, we don't want someone, an academic group or whatever, telling us what to do. How do you explain what is the argument for this is important to everybody, this matters? How do you try to depoliticize it, or, I mean, I know it's so complex. There's people who are taking lobbying money from ballot, the ballot providers.
Right.
But how do you try to depoliticize it? How do you, from a nonpartisan standpoint, what are the messages
Yeah,
you're
for us-
delivering to, I guess, to legislators?
Mostly
or
to
more
election officials.
The grassroots.
Yeah, mostly we work with election officials at the town, county, and state level. And they're chartered with administering elections in a nonpartisan way, even though some of them were elected and some of them were appointed. They have a job to do that is independent of political party. So our approach to them is talking about how we can help them solve their upstream and downstream problems. So, for example, you may have seen in Virginia in November, there were a few recounts. One of those reasons the recounts happened was because people didn't mark their ballots properly. So there were challenged ballots. So some of this you can build in by design. Some of this you can include in instructions in the voting booth or in the absentee ballot envelope. But election officials are not equipped to even make a decent version of that, and they tend to over-explain and stuff like that. So we just talk about it in terms of, if you do this, you are a lot less likely to have recounts, right? If you do this, you're a lot less likely to show up on the headlines of the Washington Post. Seriously, this is a big motivation. The award is nothing happened, right? Nothing made the headlines. It just went fine. So that's how we do it. Yes.
So it looked like a lot of the stuff that you were doing was this sort of initial research, I guess, to present about how to change an election process. Do you guys have a deliverable, and how do you kind of follow up on sort of measuring the success? Are there ways that they kind of change a post-mortem, I guess, here's what went well this election? And I know it's government, so I'm sure things are slow to change, but how to measure how things change election to election?
Yeah. So one of the cool things is that there's this natural iterative process, because there are actually elections all the time. And one of the things that we tell election officials is that you can make a tiny change in this election and make sure nothing breaks, make sure you feel comfortable with that, and then you can go make another tiny change in the next election. So, so that's cool. My team has been having a lot of conversations about how we measure impact. My research partner, Whitney Quisenberry, and I have been at this for a really long time. Actually, we started doing this kind of stuff in the beginning of the 2000s, thanks to the butterfly ballot, Bush v. Gore, all that stuff. History. So it is small incremental change over time. But how do we're funded partly by grants and partly by contracts, and our funders really want to know, how are you going to grow? What's the impact that you're having? And so working on that is really interesting and hard, because we can't just say people, because this is, so far as we can tell, impossible to measure. People performed better on ballots in real elections because other factors in the election change from time to, the rules change, or the laws change, or the voting system changes, or some other part of the operations changes. And so we can't say that our one thing actually improved. So that's tricky and interesting. So what we deliver, though, if you go to our site, civicdesign.org, one of the things that we deliver is called the Field Guides to Ensuring Voter Intent. And these are beautiful little booklets that we give to election officials and other Govy people for free, thanks to the MacArthur Foundation and the Democracy Fund, that just have 10 guidelines with examples for design practices that, and there are 10 of those, and they cover different topics. So that's one thing. But with every study that we do, we make templates and tools that we then give out for free. So the study that Bill was in for voter guides, we developed with the League of Women Voters an information architecture for websites a template for different page types that you would want to include in a voter guide. This is in Word, by the way, because that's what they've got. And we made webinars so people could learn how to use them if they don't have much in the way of skill. And so all of that's available for free on our website. We go around and give lots of workshops. That's a deliverable as far as I'm concerned. There are conferences of election officials twice a year in every state. So that's fun. So that's the kind of stuff. And now we have a pretty big library of stuff. And our job over the next couple of years will be creating a toolkit that is easy to find and find the tools in. So, Susan, did you have a question?
Practical question. I want to recruit folks with low literacy. Any tips? How do I do that? How do I find them?
Yeah. How to recruit people with low literacy. We work with community groups that serve underserved neighborhoods. And that can be as broad as churches and community centers, but also in Boston, there's there are a couple of agencies in the mayor's office. One is the Office of Immigration, the Office of Immigrant Services, and one is the Office of Neighborhood Services. And they both have people who speak lots of languages, and they're connected directly with folks in neighborhoods. And so if you don't live in Boston or Cambridge, there are also services like this in other largish towns and cities. So that's a good place to start. Like any other community, though, it's like being where they are and making friends and sort of hanging out for a while. Like if you do work with people with disabilities, for example. Like just showing up at the Lighthouse for the Blind is not going to work, right? So having a longer relationship is really the best start. How are we doing for time, Brian? Okay. You bet.
So there's a movement towards ranked choice voting in Massachusetts right now, and there are challenges with comprehension of that system. And I'm wondering if you see that as an obstacle or even a threat in terms of voter trust in that system, and can that be changed to an opportunity?
I have a lot of opinions about ranked choice voting. Thank you for that question. So ranked choice voting, for anybody who hasn't seen this, if you vote in Cambridge, you've seen this because they've had it for like 50 years. All of the candidates are listed and you rank them by your preference. This is also called preferential voting or instant runoff voting. The reason that election officials like it is because it saves having runoffs, right? But the way the ballots are counted is kind of mysterious. And voters who are used to first past the post system, which is what we have, the 50% plus one wins, have a hard time even thinking about what their second choice would be, let alone their 15th choice, you know? So my personal opinion is ranked choice voting is for smarty pants people who are super privileged and who think about their choices in a more theoretical way. It is not great for people who are on the lower end of engagement, who maybe have not paid attention to all of the information that's available about all of the candidates, because they're picking a winner, and people don't understand how their votes are counted. Now, some of this is resolved over time, right? Like when Oakland, California first implemented ranked choice voting in 2012, I think, their first mayor was elected through, yes, that was during the Occupy movement. Their first mayor was elected through ranked choice voting. There were riots in the street because nobody understood how it was that the mayor won with only 24% of the vote. Like, how does that actually work? Now, granted, the context was pretty volatile at the time, so there's that. But what we've seen, and part of my team, who doesn't hold my opinions, they're more neutral about this, has gone to work on trying to make the best possible design for ranked choice voting. A thing that we've seen is that voters who are new to it do better if they have fewer things to rank the first couple of elections, and that over time they can handle more. So it's interesting to see that idea percolating in lots of different parts of the country. Massachusetts is not the only one, and some places have had ranked choice voting and then rescinded it, partly because of the lack of understanding and how hard it is to educate people to do it. In San Francisco, after I think they started it in 2004, candidates and supervisor districts started campaigning for people to vote for them for the number 2 ranking or the number 3 ranking. If there were like 10 or 12 candidates, they knew the vote was going to be split, so their odds were better if they were ranked number 2. So we could go on for a long time about that.
Do you think the United States will ever change the voting day from the antiquated voting day from Tuesday? And what would that do? Do you have any research that suggests? I mean, if we look at Europe, we see that there's a lot more turnout. But do you have any research that suggests what that would do for the United States turnout?
We really don't. There are a few states that are all vote by mail, for example, and the theory being that that will improve turnout. The data is inconclusive on that. I think there are a lot of other problems besides what day it is. For example, in some states, there is no provision for employees to leave their jobs to go vote. Like, you're not given time off to go vote. That's bullshit, right? Like, so if we could fix that kind of stuff, that would be really great. Also, those happen to coincide with places where there's not early voting. So the lack of consistency across jurisdictions is a contributor. One of the arguments for not making it a holiday or not putting it on the weekend is that a lot of government workers need to be employed to put on an election, and now you are paying them holiday pay or double time, and that increases the expenses of doing it. So none of this is really that simple or straightforward. So let's do one more. Kyle. Hi.
Hi. Great talk. And I'm so glad that you mentioned how stupid some of us feel when we're voting, because I can tell you when I moved up here from Philadelphia, the first time I voted in New Hampshire, I felt so dumb because all I knew in Philadelphia was this huge switchboard of a voting machine.
Right.
We pulled our lever, and then I walk in thinking I knew what I was doing, and I'm handed this form that's that long double-page thing. I'm like, what the hell is this? And everybody knew what they were doing. I'm like, okay, and I'm just going to go about this. My question is two things. Do you do any kind of testing or research on those crazy machines? Because they're wild switchboards. They are insanely unusable. And then also, this is probably a naive question, but will we ever just adopt one thing for every state?
So, lovely questions. Thank you. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York made some decisions when they bought newish voting systems that they wanted to make them as much like the old voting systems as possible. They have this romantic relationship with lever machines, which is the mechanical machine that Kyle was describing, where you go into a voting booth and there are all these mechanical switches, and like they're next to each choice, and it's gigantic, and it's very, if there's a lot of stuff on the ballot, People who are short can't reach the top ones, so they undervote those contests, and people who are very tall miss the bottom ones, so they undervote those. So like, there's all kinds of problems with that. But like, there's this seriously romantic view of voting, and it's all around the mechanical lever machines. Now you can hack those too because they have gears. Anyway, the future of voting and the future of voting systems looks like this. You download an app onto your phone from your local election website that has your ballot on it based on your address and probably some other personally identifying information. You mark your ballot on your own phone. You get a QR code at the end of that or some other barcode, and you go to a vote center. This is now not location-based polling places, right? You could go any place in the state, for example. And you walk up to a voting machine where you scan the code on your phone. It brings it up on a beautiful off-the-shelf tablet where you can review your choices and change them if you want to. You press a button and it prints out your choices, which you can also double check. And then that paper record gets tallied in a machine, and your vote also gets counted and stored on the electronic side. So there's this sort of double accounting system, which is great. Los Angeles County is about to go pilot theirs. They've been working on this for about 5 years already. It's really cool. It's really great. They designed it exactly the way we would all done it. Lots of community involvement. I'm super excited about it. In the meantime, little bits of work have happened in design research leading up to that point, including designing a digital ballot interface for people to mark their ballots, which my team did, just by the way. We call it the Anywhere Ballot, and you can go to anywhereballot.com and try out a kind of crappy prototype. But out of that came design principles that all of the commercial voting system vendors have adopted because we made it open and gave it a Creative Commons license. So standards are not being defined in that way. Nobody's forcing anybody to do anything because states' rights, different discussion. But there are these de facto standards that are emerging as election systems companies, voting system companies, start to understand product design and usability and accessibility and just do a better job of their job. And we're about to all go into a cycle where states are buying new voting systems. And so you will start to see that show up in polling places. So that's super exciting. Thanks, everybody. That was fun.